Chloe Hill had always been an ambitious student, driven by a desire to excel in her psychology major. She spent countless hours studying, participating in research, and engaging in discussions about the human mind's complexities. Her curiosity often led her down unconventional paths, seeking to understand the darker aspects of human behavior. One evening, while she was in the campus library, buried under a mountain of textbooks and notes, her phone buzzed with a new email notification. She ignored it at first, assuming it was another reminder from one of her professors or a message about an upcoming assignment. But the persistent vibration caught her attention, and she finally glanced at the screen. The subject line read, "Exclusive Invitation, a Unique Psychological Study." Intrigued, Chloe opened the email. It was concise and mysterious, sent from a university research group she hadn't heard of. The message invited her to participate in a cutting-edge psychological experiment, one that promised to explore the depths of human behavior in ways that had never been done before. The study offered substantial financial compensation and the opportunity to contribute to groundbreaking research. The only condition was that the details were strictly confidential, and she would need to sign a non-disclosure agreement before participating. Chloe's heart raced as she read the email. She had always been drawn to the more unconventional aspects of psychology, and this experiment sounded like the opportunity of a lifetime. The money was also tempting. College life was expensive, and she could use the extra cash. But more than that, the idea of being part of something so exclusive and potentially revolutionary excited her. After a moment of hesitation, she replied to the email, expressing her interest. A few hours later, she received a response with the date, time, and location for the first meeting. The study was to take place off-campus in a private facility about 20 minutes away. There was no mention of the study's nature, only that it was designed to push the boundaries of human understanding. Chloe felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension as she marked the date on her calendar. She decided not to tell anyone about it, not even her roommate, Emma. Something about the secrecy surrounding the experiment made her want to keep it to herself. As the day of the experiment approached, Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to embark on something much bigger than she had anticipated. But she was too intrigued to back out now. The day of the experiment arrived, and Chloe made her way to the designated location. The building was tucked away in a quiet industrial area on the outskirts of town. It was unremarkable, with tinted windows and a single metal door at the entrance. The building looked more like a generic office complex than a research facility, which only added to the sense of mystery. Chloe double-checked the address to make sure she was in the right place, then walked up to the door. As she approached, a small security camera above the door beeped, and the door clicked open, revealing a sterile, brightly lit hallway. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The hallway was eerily quiet, and her footsteps echoed on the polished floor. At the end of the hallway, she found a reception desk manned by a young woman in a white lab coat. The woman had a cold, professional demeanor that made Chloe feel uneasy. "Chloe Hill?" the woman asked, glancing up from her computer. "Yes, that's me," Chloe replied. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome. Please sign this non-disclosure agreement, and we'll get started." Chloe signed the document, her curiosity growing with each passing moment. The receptionist handed her a visitor's badge and directed her to a waiting room down the hall. As Chloe walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far more intense than she had anticipated. The waiting room was sparse, with plain white walls and a few chairs arranged around a low table. 3 other students were already there, 2 men and a woman, all of whom looked as nervous as Chloe felt. They exchanged awkward glances, but said nothing. After a few minutes, the door opened, and a man in a lab coat stepped inside. He was tall, with sharp features, and an air of authority that made the room feel even smaller. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice calm and measured. "My name is Dr. Marcus, and I'll be overseeing today's experiment. Thank you all for volunteering." He paused, studying each of them in turn before continuing. "You've all been selected for this study because of your unique backgrounds and psychological profiles. Today, you'll be participating in a series of tests designed to explore the limits of human behavior and morality. I must warn you that the nature of these tests may be unsettling. If any of you wish to leave now, you may do so. No questions asked. Chloe's heart raced as she considered her options. Something about Dr. Marcus's tone made her uneasy, but she was also intrigued. What kind of experiment could be so disturbing that they were given a chance to back out? No one moved. After a moment, Dr. Marcus nodded. Very well. If you're ready, please follow me. Dr. Marcus led them down another hallway, this one lined with doors on either side. He stopped in front of a door marked with a number and gestured for them to enter. Inside was a small room, furnished with a single table and 4 chairs. A large mirror covered one wall and a camera was mounted in the corner, its lens trained on the center of the room. Please take a seat, Dr. Marcus instructed. Chloe sat down, her nerves on edge. The other 3 students followed suit, exchanging uncertain glances. Once they were seated, Dr. Marcus closed the door behind them and stood at the head of the table. The first test is simple, he said. In front of each of you is a small device with a single button. When I leave the room, you will each be asked to press that button. If you press it, a person in another room will receive a mild electric shock. You will not see this person, and they will not see you. The shock is not lethal, but it will cause discomfort. Chloe looked down at the device in front of her. It was small, about the size of a remote control, with a single red button in the center. You may choose not to press the button, Dr. Marcus continued. However, if you choose not to, the experiment will end, and you will forfeit your compensation. If you choose to press it, the experiment will continue, and you will be rewarded. The choice is yours. With that, Dr. Marcus left the room, leaving them in silence. For a few moments, no one moved. Chloe stared at the button, her mind racing. The idea of shocking someone, even a stranger, made her uneasy. But she didn't want to quit, not after coming this far. Finally, the woman across from her reached out and pressed her button. There was a brief pause, and then a faint, muffled sound from somewhere beyond the walls. A gasp, followed by a low groan. Chloe's stomach twisted, but before she could react, the man next to her pressed his button. Another sound, this one louder, more pained. The remaining man hesitated, his hand hovering over the button. Chloe could see the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict she felt. But after a few agonizing seconds, he pressed it too. The room fell silent again. Chloe's heart pounded in her chest. 3 out of 4 had pressed the button. Now it was her turn. She stared at the device, her hand trembling. What was the point of this test? Was it just to see how far they were willing to go? Or was there something more sinister at play? Her thoughts raced as she weighed her options. She could refuse, end the experiment now, and walk away with her conscience intact. But a part of her was curious. What would happen if she pressed it? What would it mean for the rest of the experiment? With a deep breath, Chloe made her decision. She reached out and pressed the button. The sound that followed was sharp, a cry of pain that sent a shiver down her spine. She quickly pulled her hand back, feeling a wave of guilt wash over her. But it was done. The door opened, and Dr. Marcus re-entered the room, his expression unreadable. "Very good," he said, his voice calm. "You've all completed the first test. The next will be more challenging." As the experiment continued, Chloe began to notice changes in the group dynamics. The other participants, whom she had barely known at the start, were now familiar faces, but not in the way she had expected. The woman, who had been the first to press the button, was named Alyssa. She was small and delicate-looking, with a nervous energy that had been apparent from the beginning. The way she trembled when she pressed the button made Chloe think she wasn't naturally inclined to hurt others, but something had pushed her to do it. The 2 men, David and Mark, were polar opposites. David was quiet, almost withdrawn, with a haunted look in his eyes that suggested he had seen too much already. Mark, on the other hand, was defiant, his every action laced with anger and frustration. He had started to push back against Dr. Marcus, questioning the purpose of the experiment and demanding answers. But no matter how much Mark challenged the situation, he never refused to participate. Chloe found herself drawn to Mark's boldness, even though it scared her. He was the only one who seemed willing to stand up to Dr. Marcus, but his defiance was also dangerous. It was clear that Dr. Marcus was not a man to be crossed, and Chloe feared what might happen if Mark pushed too far. One day, after another grueling test that had left them all shaken, Mark cornered Chloe in the hallway. "You need to stop doing what he says," Mark whispered urgently, his eyes darting around to make sure they weren't being watched. "This isn't just some psychological experiment. He's playing with us." Chloe felt a cold knot of fear twist in her stomach. She had been trying to convince herself that the experiment, while extreme, was still under control, but Mark's words shattered that illusion. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," Mark said, his voice low and intense. "The way he's pushing us, making us hurt people, it's not about research. He's testing us, seeing how far we'll go before we break. And I don't think he's going to stop until one of us does." Chloe's heart raced as she considered Mark's words. She had felt the same sense of unease, the feeling that they were being manipulated, but she hadn't wanted to admit it. Now, standing in the dimly lit hallway with Mark's words echoing in her mind, she realized that she was in over her head. But what could she do? She couldn't just walk away, not now, not after everything that had happened. And besides, part of her was still curious, still driven by her need to see where this would all lead. But Mark's warning weighed heavily on her, and she found herself looking at Dr. Marcus with increasing suspicion. The next day, Dr. Marcus gathered the group in a room that was starkly different from the others. This one was dimly lit, with a single table in the center. On the table were 4 objects, each covered by a cloth. Chloe felt a sense of dread wash over her as she eyed the covered items, wondering what was hidden beneath. Dr. Marcus wasted no time. "Today's test will require each of you to make a decision," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "Beneath each cloth is a different tool. Each of you will select one and use it on the person in the next room. The person is restrained and cannot defend themselves. Your task is simple. Extract information from them using any means necessary." Chloe's stomach churned at the implication. The other participants looked equally horrified, but no one spoke up. "You will be told what information to extract once you have chosen your tool," Dr. Marcus continued. "This is a test of your ability to follow orders under pressure, as well as your willingness to push moral boundaries. Remember, you can choose to walk away at any time, but doing so will forfeit your participation in the experiment." Mark's warning echoed in Chloe's mind. He was right. This wasn't just about psychological research. Dr. Marcus was deliberately placing them in situations where they would be forced to commit acts of cruelty. But the allure of the experiment, the need to see it through, was too strong for Chloe to resist. Dr. Marcus gestured to the table. "Please, choose your tools." Alyssa was the first to move, her hand trembling as she lifted the cloth to reveal a pair of pliers. She looked at Dr. Marcus, her face pale, but he simply nodded, and she picked up the pliers, her expression one of resignation. David went next, revealing a small scalpel. He stared at it for a moment, his face impassive, before picking it up with a steady hand. Mark was the third to choose, uncovering a thin, flexible rod that looked like it could be used for something far more sinister than Chloe wanted to imagine. He picked it up with a grim expression, his defiance replaced by a cold determination. Chloe was the last. With a deep breath, she reached out and lifted the final cloth, revealing a syringe filled with a clear liquid. She swallowed hard, the reality of what she was about to do, hitting her like a ton of bricks. She had no idea what the liquid was, but she knew it wasn't meant to heal. Dr. Marcus led them to another room, where a single chair was bolted to the floor. In the chair sat a man, his face obscured by a hood, his body restrained with heavy straps. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with a frantic rhythm. Chloe's heart pounded as she looked at the man, knowing that she was about to cross a line she could never uncross. Dr. Marcus handed each of them a piece of paper with a single word written on it. Chloe's read, "Confess." She glanced at the others, who were reading their own papers with varying degrees of shock and disbelief. "Your task is to make him confess to a crime he didn't commit," Dr. Marcus explained, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You may use any method you see fit. When you believe he has confessed truthfully, you may stop." Alyssa was the first to act. She approached the man, her steps hesitant but purposeful, and pressed the pliers to his hand. Chloe looked away as she heard the man's muffled scream. David followed, making a small incision on the man's arm with the scalpel, the sharp blade slicing through flesh like paper. Mark, with a look of grim resolve, struck the man's legs with the rod, each impact causing the man to jerk in his restraints. Chloe stood frozen, the syringe in her hand feeling like a lead weight. She couldn't do it. She couldn't bring herself to hurt this man, even if he was a stranger, even if it was just an experiment. But then she heard the man's voice, weak and desperate, begging them to stop. "Please," he gasped. "I'll tell you whatever you want. Just make it stop." The others paused, waiting for Dr. Marcus's signal. But he simply watched, his expression unreadable. Chloe knew what was expected of her. The man had to confess, but she hadn't done her part yet. With trembling hands, she approached the man and, with a silent apology in her heart, injected the liquid into his arm. He convulsed violently, his body straining against the restraints as the liquid took effect. Finally, he broke. "I did it," he screamed. "I did it. Just make it stop." Dr. Marcus raised a hand, and the participants stepped back, their faces pale and drawn. Chloe felt sick to her stomach, the reality of what she had done crashing down on her. The man had confessed, but it wasn't real. They had forced him to say what they wanted to hear, breaking his will in the process. Dr. Marcus nodded approvingly. "You've all passed the test. You may return to the waiting room." As they filed out, Chloe couldn't bring herself to look at the man in the chair. She had crossed the line just as Mark had warned, and there was no going back. Back in the waiting room, the group sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The air was thick with tension, and Chloe could feel the weight of what they had done pressing down on her like a physical force. Mark was the first to speak, his voice low and filled with anger. "This has gone too far. We need to get out of here." David shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "And go where? Do you think they'll just let us walk away after what we've done?" Alyssa, who had been staring at her hands in silence, suddenly burst into tears. "I can't do this anymore," she sobbed. "I just can't." Chloe felt the same despair rising within her. She had thought she could handle the experiment, but it was clear that they were all being pushed to their limits. And yet, despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to leave. The experiment had a hold on her, a dark allure that kept her tethered to it, even as it tore her apart. Dr. Marcus entered the room, his presence immediately silencing the group. He looked at each of them in turn, his expression unreadable. "I understand that today's test was difficult," he said, his tone almost gentle. "But it was necessary. You've proven that you can make hard decisions under pressure, that you're willing to do what it takes to achieve the desired outcome." Chloe wanted to scream at him, to demand to know what kind of twisted game he was playing, but she remained silent, her fear paralyzing her. "There is one final test," Dr. Marcus continued, "the ultimate test of your commitment to the experiment and to the pursuit of understanding human nature. You will each face this test alone. If you pass, you will be free to leave, with the knowledge that you've contributed to something truly extraordinary." "And if we fail?" Mark asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Dr. Marcus smiled, but it was devoid of warmth. "Failure is not an option." The final test took place in a room that was completely different from the others. It was small, almost claustrophobic, with walls that seemed to close in on Chloe as she stepped inside. A single chair sat in the center of the room, and on a table next to it was a small vial of clear liquid and a syringe. Dr. Marcus stood by the door, his expression inscrutable. "This is your final test, Chloe," he said. "You've already proven that you're willing to inflict pain on others. Now you must prove that you're willing to make the ultimate sacrifice." Chloe's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the syringe. She had known from the beginning that this experiment was different, that it was darker and more dangerous than anything she had ever encountered. But she hadn't expected this. "The liquid in the vial is a powerful paralytic," Dr. Marcus explained. "Once injected, it will render you completely immobile. But you will remain conscious. You will experience the sensation of being buried alive, of being trapped in your own body, unable to move, unable to scream." Chloe's blood ran cold. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because this is the final boundary," Dr. Marcus replied. "The line between life and death, between control and helplessness. By crossing this line, you will transcend the limits of your own humanity." Chloe's mind raced as she considered her options. She could refuse, walk away now, and never look back. But she knew that if she did, she would always wonder what lay on the other side of that boundary. The experiment had already taken so much from her, and now it demanded even more. With a trembling hand, she picked up the syringe. Dr. Marcus watched her closely, his expression unreadable. Chloe felt a sick sense of inevitability as she filled the syringe with the liquid, her mind screaming at her to stop, to run, to do anything but go through with this. But she couldn't. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to back out now. She pressed the needle to her skin, her hand shaking uncontrollably. The thought of what would happen next terrified her, but there was no turning back. With a deep breath, she injected the liquid into her arm. The effect was immediate. Chloe felt her muscles seize up, her body going rigid as the paralytic took hold. She tried to move, to scream, but she couldn't. Her body was no longer her own, and she was trapped inside it, a prisoner of her own mind. Dr. Marcus watched her with a clinical detachment, his expression giving nothing away. "You've done well, Chloe," he said, his voice echoing in the silence of the room. "You've crossed the final boundary." As Chloe's vision began to blur, she realized with a sickening clarity that she had been wrong all along. This wasn't about understanding human nature. It wasn't about pushing boundaries or exploring the limits of morality. This was about control, about breaking them down, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. And as the darkness closed in around her, Chloe understood the true nature of the experiment. It wasn't about the boundaries she had crossed. It was about the ones she could never escape. When Chloe awoke, she was lying in a hospital bed, her body still weak from the effects of the paralytic. She blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, her mind foggy as she tried to piece together what had happened. A nurse entered the room, her expression kind but distant. "You're awake," she said. "How are you feeling?" Chloe's voice was barely a whisper. "What happened?" The nurse hesitated, then glanced at the chart in her hand. "You were found unconscious at the facility where the experiment was taking place. The staff there called for medical assistance, and you were brought here. You've been out for a few days." Chloe's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the nurse's words. The experiment, Dr. Marcus, the final test. It all felt like a nightmare, but the dull ache in her arm told her it was real. "The others?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling. The nurse shook her head. "I'm afraid I don't have that information, but you're safe now. You'll recover." Safe? The word felt hollow, meaningless. Chloe knew that she would never be truly safe again. The experiment had changed her, stripped away her humanity, and left her with nothing but the hollow shell of who she used to be. As the nurse left the room, Chloe stared up at the ceiling, her mind drifting back to the events of the past few days. She had been pushed to the brink, forced to confront the darkest corners of her soul, and in the end, she had lost. The experiment had taken everything from her, her morality, her innocence, her sense of self. And now, all she was left with was the crushing weight of what she had done, the knowledge that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Chloe knew that she would never be the same. The experiment had revealed the darkness within her, and there was no going back. She had been broken, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. And as she lay in the sterile hospital bed, Chloe realized that the experiment was far from over. It would haunt her for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the boundaries she had crossed, the darkness she had embraced, and the humanity she had lost. Months passed, and Chloe returned to her life on campus, but nothing was the same. She went through the motions of attending classes, studying, and interacting with her peers, but she felt like a stranger in her own body. The experiment had left deep scars, both physical and psychological, that she couldn't escape. She avoided the others who had participated in the experiment. They had all been given non-disclosure agreements, sworn to secrecy about what had happened. But Chloe didn't need to speak to them to know that they were all suffering in their own ways. She saw it in their eyes when they passed each other on campus, haunted, broken, lost. Dr. Marcus had disappeared. The facility where the experiment had taken place was shut down, leaving no trace of the horrors that had occurred within its walls. Chloe tried to find information about him, to understand who he was and why he had done what he did, but there was nothing. It was as if he had never existed. Chloe's nightmares became a nightly occurrence, vivid and terrifying. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, the sensation of being paralyzed and buried alive still fresh in her mind. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was still being watched, that Dr. Marcus was still out there, waiting to pull her back into his twisted experiment. One day, as Chloe was walking back to her dorm, she received an envelope slipped under her door. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper with a familiar, cold message. "The boundaries you've crossed are just the beginning. The experiment continues." Chloe's heart raced as she realized the implications. It wasn't over. Dr. Marcus was still out there, still playing his twisted games. And she knew, with a sickening certainty, that he wasn't done with her yet. She crumpled the paper in her hand, her mind racing. There was no escaping the experiment, no way to undo what had been done. But she refused to be a pawn in Dr. Marcus's game any longer. For the first time since the experiment, Chloe felt a spark of defiance. She had been broken, but she wasn't completely defeated. She had to find a way to fight back, to reclaim the humanity that had been stripped away from her. But deep down, she knew that the boundaries had already been crossed, and there was no going back. The experiment had changed her forever, and the darkness that had been unleashed would never be contained. But she would fight, even if it meant losing herself in the process. Because if there was one thing she had learned from the experiment, it was that some boundaries were worth crossing, even if the cost was everything. Thank you for watching the experiment. Please consider subscribing today and helping a new YouTube channel grow and bring you more dark and morbid content. Also, check out the links to our short content videos. We upload 2 a day. Again, thank you for your support.